Muito bem, podemos começar os trabalhos do dia, agora com a conferência do professor Christopher Janaway, que será introduzido por nós pelo Gabriel Guilherme.
So
Guilherme,
it's a
perdão.
Guilherme. No problem. It's a big honor. It's a big honor and pleasure to introduce the Professor Christopher Janaway. He's a very important and famous philosopher from England. He obtained a doctorate, his doctorate from the University of Oxford, and since 2005, he is a professor at the University of Southampton. He has published several books and articles, especially on Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, like Schopenhauer, a very short introduction, and Beyond Selflessness, reading Nietzsche's genealogy. He was also the general editor of the Cambridge edition of the works of Schopenhauer in translation, and today he will present us with an exhibition on Schopenhauer's Indian ethics. Bom, vou falar em português agora, tá? É uma enorme honra e prazer apresentar-lhes o professor Christopher Janaway. Ele é um filósofo muito importante da Inglaterra, né, e famoso. Ele obteve o seu doutorado na Universidade de Oxford e desde 2005 ele é professor da Universidade de Southampton. Ele publicou vários livros e artigos, sobretudo sobre Schopenhauer e Nietzsche, né, como, por exemplo, Schopenhauer, uma introdução muito breve, né, e para além do altruísmo, lendo a genealogia do Nietzsche. Ele foi o editor da tradução de Cambridge, né, da obra do Schopenhauer, e hoje ele vai falar sobre a ética indiana de Schopenhauer. So please, Professor, we thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be invited, and I hope this is interesting. I'm now going to try and share my screen again. I'm not very experienced with this, so let me see. Here we go. Is that okay?
Okay. Yes.
Yep.
Okay.
Fine. Right. So I'll simply read. I may omit some passages if I think I'm going too slowly, but I will basically, I think, read the text that I've got here. So very much to Maria Lucia Cachola and all of the Brazilian colleagues who are involved in organizing this. I think it's a great event, and I'm very pleased to be, well, here. I'm still here, but I'm pleased to be here at the colloquium. I recently started to be more interested in Indian philosophy, trying to take a half-serious attempt to understand some aspects of Indian philosophy, which is a vast, enormous topic. So that interest has produced this piece. So in the essay on the basis of morals, the Upaniṣadic saying tvam asi and the metaphysical position that it alludes to appear to be crucial for the intelligibility of morality. This paper asks, how close is Schopenhauer's ethic to any Upaniṣadic or later Vedāntic position? Our answer depends on which of the following positions we are prepared to accept. So I'm going to give some reason, I think, to accept all of these 5 positions. That Schopenhauer sincerely holds an analogue of the brahman-theory. Ultimate reality comprises a oneness in which all phenomenally distinct individuals are equal. 2, that Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion between phenomenally distinct individuals is consistent with the theory of ultimately real oneness. 3, that advocating universal compassion on the basis of an ultimately real oneness is not merely pseudo-Vedānta, as Paul Hacker claimed, but is present in some Indian traditions that invoke Brahman, or the absolute. that for Schopenhauer, as for Vedanta, will is not the ultimately real oneness. It's rather a pervasive way in which that oneness is manifest to phenomenally distinct individuals. That one, I think, is more controversial and maybe undecidable. Finally, 5, a theory of ultimately real oneness provides an essential grounding for Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion. I think there is reason to believe that, but there is still a persistent trend in interpretation of Schopenhauer, which suggests that we do not need this metaphysical theory of ultimately real oneness in order to ground his ethics. So we may still wish that 5 is not true, even if it is. So I offer reasons in favor of each of these claims. This is a slightly shorter version of a paper that is going to be published in a volume edited by Patrick Hassan. So, as is well known, our single most important touchstone for Indian thought was the book Opecnut, published in 1801-2 by the French investigator Abraham Hyacinthe Anquetil-Duperron. It was a translation of an earlier work in Persian called Siri Akbar, The Great Secret, which had been produced in 1656 by the eminent Indian Mughal prince Dara Shikoh. When the young Schopenhauer first encountered this book in 1814, he, like Dara and Anquetil, thought he had found an ancient fount of truth that proclaimed a universal doctrine of the fundamental oneness of all things. Schopenhauer later propounded the view that, quote, all plurality is only apparent, that in all the individuals of this world, only one and the same truly existing essence really manifests itself, present and identical in all of them, unquote. And that is from On the Basis of Morals. And now we have a long passage in which he lists a long pedigree of previous thinkers who hold this view. So it's the chief and fundamental doctrine of the oldest book in the world, the sacred Vedas, available to us in the Upanishads. Then he goes on to mention Pythagoras, the Eleatics, Neoplatonism, Scotus Ericana, Sufism, Giordano Bruno, Spinoza, and finally Schelling, who he gives a rather mixed review to, of course. So I won't read all of that. But what happens here is there's a whole list of authorities for this view of the fundamental oneness of all things. And this list includes many for whom the unitary ultimately is something divine. But as I read it, it's important that Schopenhauer is out of line on this point. He always rejects theism, which he refers to as the old dogmatism, which he thinks Kant has destroyed. And he recognizes nothing figurative use for the concept of God. It's certainly true, Sandra Shapshay has made this point to me, it's certainly true that many of the authorities in that list are pantheists, but I believe that Schopenhauer does not accept pantheism either. He makes some dismissive comments about the very notion of pantheism in later works. And I think he thinks pantheism is either a smokescreen for theism or it's really meaningless. So I don't accept that what he thinks the truth is pantheism. Nevertheless, the thread that runs through all this historical list is the idea of there being a unitary essence underlying the world's apparent plurality. So I will take it as read as an assumption that Schopenhauer sincerely adhered to this idea and he believed it represented the most ancient universal wisdom. Okay, next section, you are that. Schopenhauer adopts from the Upanishads the famous great saying or Mahavakya of the Hindu or Brahmanic tradition, Tat Tvam Asi, you are that, which he sees as emblematic of an ethics of compassion. The wording Tat Tvam Asi is repeated 9 times in the Chandogya Upanishad, where sage Udalaka Aruni is explaining the nature of the self to his son. Self here is man. His son is Sveitaketu. It's natural to take the message to be that Sveitaketu is that self, that Atman, namely the self which is said to be reality and self of this whole world. Anquetil and Schopenhauer regard "you are that" as an identity statement, and in so doing, they're in authoritative company. Shankara's overwhelmingly influential Advaita reading of the formula is quite clear. This is Shankara. So thou just means you, that you singular in older English. The sentence "thou art that" teaches that what is denoted by the term thou is identical with what is denoted by that. Now, the latter term denotes the subject of the entire section of thinking Brahman, which is the cause of the origin and self of the world. The entity thus described is known by all students of the Vedanta as what is denoted by the term that. They likewise know that what is denoted by the term thou, or you, is the inward self, for which it has a different term. In other words, the self that you are is identical with the self, Atman, is Brahman, absolute, that is the whole world. Now, Schopenhauer cites Tattasi in his account of the basis of morality. Moral worth, he says, attaches solely to actions that arise for compassion, Mitleid, the wholly immediate sympathy in the place towards another's suffering, and hence towards the prevention or removal of this suffering. Fairly familiar idea. Schopenhauer says that the saying tvam asi expresses this compassionate, action-guiding insight into the absence of an absolute distinction between self and other. But does it? Does any part of the Indian tradition correspond with Schopenhauer's use of tvam asi? Well, there are two salient points of divergence from the Hindu sources that we've mentioned. First, Schopenhauer takes the word that to refer to any arbitrary individual being that's conventionally distinct from the individual addressed as you. And secondly, he uses the saying as an index of the moral worth of the individual's encounter with that individual. Schopenhauer says the great word tvam asi means you are this living thing. He thus takes the reference of that differently from the way Shankara explains it. However, even if the grammatical reference of tat is not this living thing, still, if all beings are identical with the absolute, it can still be said that, as Janaway Ganeri puts it, the Upanishad, the hidden connection or secret teaching, is that the self that gazes out from within my body is the same as the self that gazes out from within yours, unquote. So that's not really a very serious point. The grammar may be different. The tat, the that, doesn't refer to this living thing, it refers to this absolute. But in the end, the point might be the same. However, whereas for Schopenhauer, the point is essentially moral, he says, the knowledge that my true inner essence exists in every living thing erupts as compassion. All true virtue stems from direct intuitive cognition of the metaphysical identity of all beings. The Chandogya passages do not lead Sveitaketu in the same direction. He has received instruction as to the nature of his self, but he is not urged to regard his encounters with other beings in any particular way. There's no direct import to Sveitaketu's instruction, either in the Sanskrit text or in the Opecnut translation, or in Shankara's influential explication. Tvam asi is not an ethical maxim, as Douglas Berger puts it. It recognizes that Schopenhauer may have invented a theory and hung it upon a prominent saying taken out of context. Some commentators concluded that his ethics is not Indian in any meaningful sense. So now I want to examine that case. I'm going to talk in this section about Paul Hacker and a little bit about more okay. So in an essay originally published in 1961, Paul Hacker contended that there simply was no such thing as a traditional Indian ethics founded around tvam asi. The very idea was modern and European in origin. He calls the modern version the Schopenhauer-Deussen pseudo-Vedānta. This is from the English translation of Hacker's essay. Hacker's case has three principal strands, two historical and one philosophical. First, that the Indian neo-Vedanta thinker Vivekananda first introduced the idea of tvam asi ethics into Indian thought from the 1890s onwards, after being influenced by the German Indologist and Schopenhauer scholar and friend of Nietzsche, of course, Paul Deussen. It all came after Schopenhauer and after Deussen. Secondly, that Schopenhauer had invented the ethical use of tvam asi, there being no evidence of any such use in Indian sources prior to Schopenhauer. Thirdly, Hacker suggests, there could not be an ethics of tvam asi because it would be a, quote, logical monstrosity, unquote. Let us postpone this last issue for a while and first consider the two historical claims. That Schopenhauer had passed off his metaphysically based ethics of compassion as originating in Indian thought, when really he had appropriated selected passages to suit a theory that was his own invention, and that Deussen transmitted the Schopenhauerian reading to Vivekananda, who went on to claim it as a genuine doctrine within the Vedanta tradition. So one could examine a lot of historical evidence here. I'll try to summarize. It's certainly true that Vivekananda was not an empty soul or a sponge who soaked up European thought uncritically for want of other ideas. On the contrary, as a piece by a writer called Ayan Maharaj has shown, he was quite critical, making deep objections to Schopenhauer's metaphysics on the grounds of internal inconsistency and inaccuracy about Vedanta. He also resisted Deussen's more sympathetic way of interpreting the notion of the thing in itself. So he didn't become a mere follower either of Deussen or of Schopenhauer. That's one point. In addition, there is evidence that the ethical implication that all human beings should be treated as of equal worth was on from tvam asi in Vedanta literature. It's not in Shankara, it's not directly in the Upanishads, but the Vedanta tradition is much, much wider. For example, in a 14th century story, the great philosopher Shankara himself is shown being reprimanded by an outcast Chandala on the grounds that his differential treatment of humans contravenes his own theory of metaphysical unity. You shouldn't discriminate, shouldn't treat any living beings, particularly any humans, differently because you're a metaphysical monist. Passages in the Bhagavad Gita, the Mahabharata, and elsewhere, perhaps elsewhere in the Upanishads, can be interpreted as having similar ethical import. Vivekananda was heir to a world-affirming strand in Vedanta, which drew social and ethical consequences from non-dualism. So, although Schopenhauer was clearly reading something into the Opecnut passage on tvam asi, it's unnecessary to say that in doing so, he was completely out of line with Indian thought. Well, another case for the non-Indian nature of Schopenhauer's tvam ethics is made by Günther Zoller, who relies upon a contrast between the concepts Anerkennung and Wiedererkennung, which I would suggest are respectively recognition and self-reidentification, something like. Zoller's case is twofold. Whereas Vedanta speaks of the individual's self-reidentification with the absolute, in Schopenhauer's ethics, moral worth attaches to something different, namely recognition by an agent of the other as equally prone to suffering and in need of care. And secondly, recognition of the other is a mainstay of European, specifically Kant's moral philosophy and its further development by Fichte, and was ready to hand for Schopenhauer quite independently of any knowledge he might of Indian doctrines. So, in response, we could ask whether recognition and self-reidentification are incompatible. For Hacker, they emphatically are, and this is his logical monstrosity point. And this is a quote from Hacker, quote, "Relations between persons cannot be reduced to an egoism of the universal one, neither the monism of will nor the monism of consciousness or spirit as a real base for the concept of person. Interpersonal relationship is not identity, it's certainly not identity of a person with an impersonal being." So the thought is, if there are no persons, there can't be relations between persons. And if there's only one being, there cannot be plural beings capable of any sort of interrelations. So X is ruled out, and only a strange kind of egoism can remain. The charge of introducing a global egoism is often made against Schopenhauer, and Schopenhauer was faced with it himself in his correspondence with Johann August Becker, but his response there is succinct and surely, I think, convincing. He simply says, quote, "By egoism is meant exclusive interest in one's own individual," unquote. In other words, there's no sense to egoism once one sees beyond individuals. If ultimate reality does not contain individuals, there can be no egoism at the level of ultimate reality. So if we accept that, we can happily set aside the charge of global egoism as meaningless. There still appears to be a challenge facing Schopenhauer. If he wants an altruistic ethics, he must posit distinct individuals and give up the monistic metaphysics. But if he's more wedded to that metaphysics, he has no viable ethics. However, this is arguably much too simple a way of understanding Schopenhauer and indeed of understanding Advaita Vedanta. And again, Douglas Berger again writes, "To call Schopenhauerian ethics monistic is an oversimplification. One could make a similar case with regard to the Advaita of Shankara. Indeed, it would gross oversimplification of Advaita to represent it as simply a monistic doctrine, since it doesn't deny the concrete physical reality of the world, nor the epistemological and material relations of the self, but only maintains that this innermost self is not differentiated." So the Advaita position is actually subtle and complicated. I can only do a very, very inadequate summary here. In the Advaita position, individuals are not unreal, though at the same time, not everything that is real is ultimately real. In the Advaita system, object ordinary experience have conventional reality or practical reality, but not ultimate reality. This is a distinction that runs through a lot of Indian philosophy, Buddhism as well. To regard the world as containing distinct objects and subjects in interaction with one another is not a simple mistake. It's natural for us to do so, but when we do so, we're superimposing an image upon ultimate reality. We are in an inevitable state of avidya, or ignorance, the state for which maya, the term Schopenhauer obviously uses, is sometimes also used. If Schopenhauer's position mirrors that of Advaita, even at a broad level, we should find him saying both that individuals exist in our conventional grasp of reality and not ultimately real. Arguably, this is indeed Schopenhauer's view of reality, at least part of his understanding of Maya, which covers mortals and lets them see a world that cannot be described as either being or not being. Okay, so Schopenhauer's ethics revisited. Schopenhauer's examples of moral behavior reflect what ordinary persons know, feel, and do in their relations with other sentient beings. So there must be others whose well-being the moral agent can will. There must be an agent to do and to exercise the compassion that's constitutive of moral worth. Schopenhauer must think there are such beings as agent and patient, and that they regard one another as distinct. As Sandra Shepshay has emphasized, quote, Schopenhauer does not have a good person makes no distinction between I and the not I. He speaks only of that person's, quote, making less of a distinction for one else, himself and others, and of the distinctions being no longer an absolute one. Even when Schopenhauer describes compassion as being the other's suffering, he insists that the feeling does not nullify the self-other boundary. We feel him as his and do not imagine that it's ours. So Schopenhauer, there are distinct individuals who continue to regard one another as distinct, even when allegedly feeling one another's pain. Individuals may not be ultimately real, but they're not wholly unreal. They exist. There is then a temptation to ask, could not a recognition reading of Schopenhauer's Ethics of Compassion dispense, in principle, with any reliance on metaphysical monism and merely with the empirical reality of individuals? Well, Schopenhauer, in the end of the essay on the basis of morals, includes the famous metaphysical chapter. He calls the chapter a work of supererogation, as the task proper, that of showing compassion, it's a missentence here, the task proper, that of showing compassion as the morality, has already been completed. Sorry, there's an error. However, there is an important sense in which his ethics would be incomplete without the metaphysical monism of ultimate reality. It would fail to satisfy a more general need that Schopenhauer holds to be constitutive of human beings, namely the need for metaphysics. Schopenhauer believed we won't reach a satisfying understanding of anything unless we can disclose that which in some sense or other conditions experience, or in common parlance, about what is hidden behind nature and makes it possible. As an instance of this, Schopenhauer says that we need to know how human moral action, quote, stands in the closest relation with the whole existence of the world and the lot of human beings. We won't properly understand ethics until we get a metaphysical grounding. So, Schopenhauer also holds, these are familiar points, that behind nature as we experience ultimate reality, well, behind, in what sense behind is another question, since he thinks it's an immanent metaphysics. Ultimate real essence in itself of things, Wesen an sich der Dinge. Secondly, their being distinct individuals depends upon space and time, which are the principle of individuation. Space and time don't belong to the essence in itself of things. So because he thinks all of those things, he must say we can't obtain a truly satisfying grounding for ethics unless we relate it to an individuated ultimate reality. I shall suggest there are two kinds of grounding in play. One explanatory, answering the question, how is it possible for an individual being to be motivated directly by suffering and well-being are not its own? Other kind of grounding is justificatory, asking the question, what reason do we have to consider the compassionate way of regarding self and other as superior to egoism? In Schopenhauer's account, the compassionate agent relates to the suffering other through an intuitive insight of extreme intimacy. I will his well-being and do not will his woe quite immediately as I do only my own, he says. This immediate insight is for Schopenhauer the Urphänomen, the real primitive phenomenon of ethics. If we doubt the occurrence of such a phenomenon, Schopenhauer's theory collapses. But if we accept that some such phenomenon occurs, Schopenhauer holds that we need some metaphysical explanation for it. And he thinks that if the world merely contains discrete individuals, I and not I, and if well-being is portioned out of ultimately distinct loci, each equipped with a will whose end is its own local bit of willing, then there's no way of accounting for this unmediated intuitive insight, the instant motivating force regarding the other's suffering. If individuation were to be a feature of ultimate reality, an unbridgeable gap would attain. The states of one being could not motivate another being in the right unmediated manner. Secondly, Schopenhauer sees no way of showing that compassion has greater value than egoism if reality is limited to the conventional empirical level in which individuals present as fundamentally distinct and naturally motivated towards their own well-being. On the kind of outlooks position that Schopenhauer arguably shares with Advaita, the conventional individuated view, while not a mere mistake, is nonetheless corrigible, replaceable by the improved view of non-duality. Thus, the moral agent's immediate compassion relation to the phenomenally distinct other can claim higher epistemic value because it tracks the ultimate reality in which I and not I are not distinct. Okay, well, section 6 is called Why the Will. There's, and this is something I really only noticed recently, as I want to see if people agree with me on this. There is a total silence in On the Basis of Morals, despite all his places on the oneness of ultimate reality. He does not say that this ultimate reality. So there's that long list of predecessors share the crucial monistic insight: the Upanishads, Parmenides, Neoplatonists, Spinoza, the Bhagavad Gita, etc., etc. These seem to be invoked as interchange positions, all of which equally convey fundamental monistic truth. But to none of them, with the exception of Schelling, I think, in his 1809 Freedom essay, to none of them is it easy to attribute that the world is will. Whatever they have in common, it doesn't seem to be that. And Schopenhauer does not state that claim in the essay. He does not state that the absolute once ultimate reality is will. In the world as representation, Schopenhauer had, as we all know, prominently declared the world in itself to be will. He argued there that my awareness of my will gives me insight into an essence of myself. It's beyond mere empirical representation, and that we can extrapolate beyond that to consider the world as will. Of any clear statement to that effect in the essay On the Basis of Morals is striking. An immediately accessible explanation is tactical. Saying too much that was specific to his own philosophy might have jeopardized the anonymity required by the Danish prize composition he wrote the essay for. Schopenhauer makes that point himself. He said, I wasn't able to expound my own metaphysics here. If that is all, then we should presumably reunite Schopenhauer's now de-anonymized essay with the world as will, and consider the thing in itself as will as an essential component part of the metal grounding of the moral passion. On the other hand, if the thing in itself is will is in fact a crucial step in the metaphysical grounding, then Schopenhauer's failure to place it anywhere in plain sight, even when publishing the essay under his own name, is something of a deficiency in the essay. Schopenhauer gives distinctly mixed signals on this score in his preface to the two fundamental problems of essay. First, he says the essay laments the fourth book of The World as Will, in which, of course, the will is absolutely prominent. But then he says of the essay, I show the relation in which this real ground of ethics stands not to my metaphysics, nor to any determinate metaphysics, but rather to a universal thought or Grundgedanke that's common to very many metaphysical systems, perhaps to most, and without doubt, to the most ancient opinion, the truest of them. So in other words, it's a Vedānta that is in the Vedas and Upanishads and down the list of those other authorities, not his own metaphysics. It doesn't have to be as determinate as that. So it's not necessary the oneness, the ultimate reality, the truth is that ultimate reality is one without further specification. The will does not enter into it. So on the evidence of this statement, the thing in itself is will cannot be counted essential to the real ground of ethics. Where have we got to? Sorry, page 14. Okay. Can we find independent reasons for thinking that the thing in itself is will, should be a crucial step in the argument that grounds Schopenhauer's ethics? Well, we might reason as follows. The whole point of compassion is that it responds to suffering, and suffering, according to Schopenhauer, is essentially linked to willing. As when an obstacle is placed between the will and its temporary goal, we call this inhibition suffering. If suffering is thwarted or obstructed willing, then it makes sense to say that what we feel in responding compassionately to suffering is their will being thwarted. Then we might think that the essence we recognize as in common with the other must be will. We grasp in an immediate insight that each of us is a being that wills, that has desires and needs, satisfactions, dissatisfactions, things that go for it and things that go against it. If this recognitional insight concerns our commonality as beings of will, should not the world whole's essence be will also? Well, I think not necessarily. After all, what I recognize in the is their phenomenal suffering, their phenomenal nature as individual willing beings, qualitatively like myself. The differences between egoism, malice, and compassion are explained in terms of willing being directed towards different ends. Willing one's own well-being, willing harm to the other, willing the well-being of the other for its own sake. But all such willing consists of temporal, or at least states of the phenomenal individual. A particular species of willing is the primitive phenomenon that needs grounding, but it would be quite different to claim that the metaphysical grounding thought, Vedānta, must encompass a will that's the single essence in itself of all things at the level of ultimate reality. So, as I say in the essay, Schopenhauer doesn't state that the thing in itself is will, and arguably he doesn't need to have done so in order to provide the universal and truest metaphysical groundings for his compassion. So where does that leave our interpretation? Well, there are at least the following three choices. Either, so for TW, the thing in itself is will. So either that claim is something Schopenhauer believes, and it's essential to the metaphysical argument, but he suppresses it for purely tactical reasons to do with anonymity and doesn't reinstate it when anonymity is no longer required. Or the claim, the thing in itself is will, is something Schopenhauer believes, but it's not required as part of the complete argument on the basis of morals. Or it's not something he believes when he writes and later revises parts of morals. And it seems to me, as we move from 1 to 2 or 2 to 3, we arrive progressively at positions that can be seen as closer to Vedānta. And I'll briefly say something about that now. So we mentioned above that Vivekananda, when he in contact with Deussen and learned about Schopenhauer, made criticisms of Schopenhauer. In particular, he understood Schopenhauer to be claiming that reality is will, and argued that he was wrong to do so. In his lecture, Buddhism Vedānta, 1896, Vivekananda commented, quote, "There is something which is not will, but is existing itself as will. That I can understand, but that will is manifesting itself, I do not understand." Unquote. So from his position as in the Vedānta tradition, he wanted not to see the ultimate reality as will. On the other hand, on the one hand, he made internal objections. Will is a state that occurs in time and within an individual mind. Illegitimate to transpose it to the realm of non-dual ultimate reality. Secondly, the will as ultimate reality must conflict with Schopenhauer's soteriology of willlessness. Any ultimate reality that survives the will's negation cannot itself be the will. And this, of course, was an objection that Schopenhauer had faced from Frauenstedt, amongst others. Vivekananda also objects that Schopenhauer has misunderstood Vedanta, suggests he's been misled by reliance on the Opecnut and also conflicting Vedanta with notions of the will that are more akin to Buddhism. So as a more recent commentator has put it, the claim that the will is the thing in itself, quote, conflicts with Vedantic soteriology, according to which one can transcend the will through self-denial and meditation and realize one's noumenal nature as the pure blissful self, or Atman. So the ultimate reality cannot be will in Vedanta. But Schopenhauer's ultimate reality, the will, and the well-known passage that he wrote in the second edition of The World as Will and Representation, which I won't necessarily read the whole of. What in the is this will which presents itself in the world? What is it ultimately in itself? What is it quite apart from the fact that it presents itself as will? This question is never to be answered. And this is a famous passage which seems to suggest that ultimate reality can't be designated as the will. So there are, I'll skip a little bit here, there are developmental questions which I won't address. Has he changed his mind? Did he always think that the ultimate reality was not will? I'm not going to address those developmental questions here, but this passage that we've just seen, 1844, with which Vivekananda was probably unfamiliar, seems to be saying that the will is what the world presents itself to us as, not what the world is in ultimate reality. And in which case, in that sense, it relates to Vivekananda's preferred Vedanta position, in the sense that will is the pervasive way in which ultimate reality manifests itself to us. There is an ultimate non-individuated reality, but as with the famous Nirguna Brahman of the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, about it one can say only not. Okay, so I'm coming near the end. The question of how Schopenhauer's ethics relates to Indian thought can splinter into diverse issues informed by different background assumptions. So we started with the Opecnut. Urs App, in his magisterial study of it, writes this, quote, scholars who think that they can use some modern translation or standard Sanskrit text to study the influence of the Upanishads on Schopenhauer have a little problem, unquote. Opecnut was a product of the 17th and 18th centuries, a Persian interpretation of Sanskrit texts carried out with Indian experts, assimilated to Sufism and other religious traditions, filtered through a particular European lens by a Frenchman writing in Latin. So it was not solely Indian. But how much emphasis should we place on influences, and how pure does something have to be in order to have some significant relation to Indian thought? We saw how Hacker was prepared to dismiss all affinity between Schopenhauer and Vedanta on the grounds that no pristine Sanskrit text contained Schopenhauer's ethical views, yet argued that significant affinities were present nonetheless. How far we wish to press those affinities depends on what propositions to accept. So this is what I started with at the beginning. Are we prepared to accept? Schopenhauer holds an analogue of the brahman-theory. Ultimate reality comprises a oneness in which all phenomenally distinct individuals are identical. Do we think Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion between phenomenally distinct individuals is consistent with the theory of ultimately real oneness? Do we think advocating universal compassion on the basis of an ultimate real oneness is not merely pseudo-Vedānta, but present in some Indian traditions that invoke Brahman? Or do we think for Schopenhauer, as for Vedanta, will is not the ultimately real oneness? It's rather a pervasive way in which that oneness manifests a cognition in phenomenally distinct individuals. And finally, do we think theory of ultimately real oneness provides an essential grounding for Schopenhauer's ethics of compassion? I think if we believed all 5 of those, the other one's on the other page. I think if, oh, that's hopeless. I think if we believed all 5 of those, we could very confidently say that Schopenhauer's ethics bears comparison with the ethics that you find in the Vedanta's interpretation of the Upanishads. I end with some comments, which I'll just say. I think the main problems are with points 4 and 5. It's very difficult to be confident that Schopenhauer does not believe that will is the ultimate real oneness, given times in which he seems to be saying just that. So I think the evidence is equivocal on point 4. And point 5, well, if we have no independent reason for believing in an ultimately real oneness of the Advaita type, we may continue to think that we could find a complete ground in Schopenhauer's ethics at invoking that kind of metaphysics. So people, I think, will still carry on trying to interpret Schopenhauer without a monist metaphysics. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Janaway, for this brilliant conference that you gave us again to our Congress. We would like to invite you now to answer a couple of questions. And if you don't mind, I would like to start. I read one chapter of you, that you wrote in that Cambridge Companion to Schopenhauer. It was a long time ago, so please correct me if I am wrong. So you were trying to clarify us on the relation between will and the thing in itself, And it is a very hard question, because sometimes Schopenhauer defends that we know the thing in itself, and this thing in itself is will, and other times he says that we don't know the thing in itself because the thing itself can't be a representation, and we know the will at least in the form of time, So the will help us to have some idea of the thing in itself, but it's not exactly it. The thing in itself is an open question. And I confess that I couldn't bear this ambiguity until I read your very clarifying text, because you defended that at least didactically, we can think in not 2 but 3 sides of the word. The phenomenon, the will, that is like a bridge, a very rich bridge, and this ultimate something that we don't know exactly what is, and that is a question mark. Do you think that with your brilliant conference of today, when you showed that there is in the Indian ethics an idea of this unknown oneness, that you can support even more that original theory of the 3 sides of the word, and even you can bring more light to it, because maybe this unknown something is the oneness. Do you think you can give this light?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I mean, I did write that in 1999, so it's the last century. I'm not sure I agree with what I wrote there entirely. I mean, I'm coming from a different angle now. Obviously, it's the same issue. I think it's very difficult to set on a single interpretation of what Schopenhauer means. I mean, it's possible that, I mean, what he says is in the 2nd edition is, I've always thought this, I've always thought that the ultimate reality is something beyond any description that we can give it, and will is just the most lenient designation based on what presents itself to us in experience. The first edition, even in the revised version, doesn't really read like that. It keeps just simply saying the thing in itself is will. So I think he doesn't carefully enough distinctions that would allow us to be definitive about his position. I suppose that's when at the end I finished by saying that the textual evidence is equivocal about what he thinks about that issue. My point today was simply to try and suggest that the ethics the ethics essay does not require the thing in its will, and can survive without that notion. Whether that, if that, I mean, that either we then think, okay, now we have to go back to the world as will and orientation and read that in accordance, or say the presentation of the ethics in the essay comes with the world as will and representation. I don't think there's an easy resolution, I'm afraid. So I think you're right to not like the ambiguity, I said, but I think I'm kind of in the same position that I can't fully resolve it on Schopenhauer's behalf. It's a much discussed issue also.
Ok, thank you so much. Vocês querem que eu tente traduzir para o português? Eu fiz uma pergunta para o professor, perguntando sobre um texto antigo que ele escreveu, em que ele propõe, né, que existem 3 lados do mundo. É uma proposta didática, né, para a gente entender melhor essa ambiguidade que tem no Schopenhauer em relação à coisa em si, né, que às vezes a gente conhece a coisa em si, ela é vontade, às vezes a gente não conhece, né, é uma questão em aberto, a vontade é uma ponte para isso, né. E ele propôs essa versão de que, né, de que cabe pensar em 3 lados do mundo. O fenômeno, né, a vontade, que seria que uma ponte, né, realmente para o que o mundo é, assim, em termos absolutos, em última instância, e que a gente não conhece exatamente o que é, né. E eu perguntei para ele se a exposição dele traz um suporte para essa visão, né, original, e inclusive traz um pouco mais de luz, né, para o que seria essa coisa que a gente não que a gente não sabe, né, se isso seria o Oneness, né, como ele fala, a unidade, mais ainda do que a vontade, né. Ele foi super humilde na resposta, ele falou que é um texto muito antigo, né, do século passado, e que ele nem sabe se ele concorda ainda exatamente com tudo isso, né, mas assim, que ele prefere não se aventurar, né, nessas questões tão complexas sobre o que é a realidade em última instância, né, e que ele realmente se concentrou aqui em apenas demonstrar que, para a ética do Schopenhauer, né, essa ética não exige a coisa em si como vontade, né. Já é uma demonstração e tanto, digamos assim, né? Então a gente fica super satisfeito com essa resposta. Tem mais alguma coisa, gente, que ele falou? Eu estou resumindo um pouco, que vocês acham importante passar? Acho que tá bom, né? Ok, Janaway, thank you so much. So now we pass to other questions. So, somebody does like to start?
Please, Sandra.
Sandra, please, Sandra.
Okay, thank you so much. Chris, thanks so much for this wonderful talk. And I think you might know where I'm coming from in this line of questioning, because we shared papers beforehand. But I want to say, Chris, that I agree with you in your last response that the essay on the basis of morality doesn't require the claim that the thing in itself is will. But I would actually want to say something stronger than that, which is that the claim that the thing in itself is will is actually at odds with his ethical thought. And I think in part because I think, as you put it, the Grundgedanke, the ultimate reality is oneness. in some ways, in order to get his ethics of compassion off the ground, in order for that guiding metaphysical insight to conceptually be linked in some ways to something that would be action guiding, requires some conceptual connection between that ultimate oneness and value. And so, and that's why, in part, I think that list of all those ancient and more modern systems of thought that hold that Grundgedanke, that oneness idea, Schopenhauer, all of the thinkers on the list are in some way or another some kind of spiritualist monist rather than a materialist monist, right? He could have put a lot of materialists on that list, and they would have been monists as well. Epicurus, Dolbach, Gassendi, others, Hobbes, but they're not on the list. I think in part because the kind of monist he's after there is a spiritualist one. I think a pantheist kind of one, and so I just wanted to hear more about why you think he doesn't actually sort of require a more spiritualist sort of monist in order to get the ethics of compassion off the ground in terms of guiding action, motivating compassionate action, and drawing some kind of conceptual link between value and that oneness. Because otherwise, it seems to me that the notion that you are this one thing, and you shouldn't treat any other living being differently is kind of a non sequitur, unless it's a spiritualist kind of monist that contains some value in it. So that's my question.
Okay, there's a lot in that. So firstly, as I hinted when giving the talk, Schopenhauer's comments about the notion of pantheism are fairly strongly critical of the whole idea of pantheism. I mean, he does mention it in after that list of the Upanishads and the Eleatics and blah, blah, blah. He does list pantheism as the debate that contemporary philosophy professors have to deal with. But elsewhere, he very strongly says that pantheism is just an empty notion, because if you're saying that the world is God, either you using the word God with some full sense, or you're not. Otherwise, you're just saying the world is the world. Says, and you're either then smuggling in a kind of covert theism, or you're saying something. And I think that's a very strong condemnation of the worth of anything called a pantheistic doctrine. That's how I read those passages. So I'd be surprised. It's true, as you pointed out to me, that many of the authorities that he lists are pantheistic in some way. But I don't think it's very unclear what the Eleatics view is. Very unclear that the Eleatics view is not of a material reality, because I don't think they really distinguish the material from the immaterial at that stage. So that, it's quite unclear to me that that Attic one is not a material. For example, and materialism. Matter obviously for Schopenhauer can't. It is empirical. Matter is what occupies space and time, and explained through space, time, and causality. So there couldn't be a matter in itself. For Schopenhauer, I guess, for this sort of Kantian reasons. So the oneness couldn't be matter, I think, couldn't be material. So that's the reason why he doesn't mention it. As for the question about value, well, I think the question of value is a difficult one in his ethics, because, you could say that suffering and well-being are themselves, the locus of value, so that if stuff is occurring, something bad is happening. And that alleviating it is good, but he doesn't even really say that. Well, he just says it would be morally good if you did it. He doesn't, there's no imperative to it. So I think in the end, and this may be a deficiency in his theory, but I think in the end, the higher value that attaches to morality is ultimately a higher epistemic value. It's that it corresponds more accurately with the way ultimate reality is, which is one. So you may think that impoverishes the ethics, but that's the superiority of value that morality has, I think, for him ultimately, which pretty much what he says in the metaphysical chapter. There are two ways of looking at the world. You can look at it as composed of individual things that are fundamentally distinct, or you can look at this oneness, which is superior. And the superiority is epistemic. It's, this gets closer to the ultimate truth. So that is why compassion is more valuable than egoism. I know you don't like that.
Well, I guess one quick follow-up with it. Then, to me, if that's all the value of an action of moral worth, it's simply it has more epistemic value. It wouldn't distinguish the moral action really much from and the value of that from aesthetic experience, right? If one just is better in touch with the way the world is will, then you wouldn't really, I guess it would be hard to distinguish the differing values of, say, like musical experience, which should be the same thing, and compassionate action. Both would have, it seems, the same epistemic value, but the moral value of a compassionate action seems to be something in addition. And I think, I'll leave this whole line of questioning. I know there are others, but I do think that there's something important in Schopenhauer's invocation of practical mysticism in this way as well, which is different from the aesthetic.
Okay, yeah, no, that's interesting. But of course, ultimately, reaching some kind of transcendent experience of unity with the oneness is it's the ultimate. And you might say, in a sense, aesthetics is closer to that than morality. And hence, why should it not be that ethics is at least on a par epistemically with ethics, given that it's closer to the ultimateness that Schopenhauer wants to put it. I think if you read it, the book in this way, as culminating in willlessness, which not everybody does, but if that's the ultimate, as it were, then aesthetics is the more accurate hint as to that ultimate value than the morality is. So I can't see, if that's how you read it, then I can't see why it would be an objection that that my reading makes aesthetics just as valuable as morality.
Thank you so much, professors. I will translate now in Portuguese, summarizing. Bom, tivemos aqui um duelo de gigantes delicioso. A professora Sandra, ela acredita, resumindo um pouco, né? Ela acredita que a questão do não é suficiente por si só para fundar a ética da compaixão do Schopenhauer, né? ela começou falando do materialismo, né, que no fundamento da moral, toda a lista de filósofos que o Schopenhauer cita, muitos deles são materialistas, eles defendem uma espécie de monismo materialista, mas depois ela mudou, né, para o conceito que ela prefere, que ela já apresentou para a gente semana passada, né, do monismo espiritual, né, que seria uma espécie de panteísmo. Né, e ela acredita que tem mais coisa, né, aí, né, além do e que, portanto, a vontade como a coisa em si é muito importante, sim, né, nessa fundação da ética do Schopenhauer. Tem a questão dos graus de compaixão e a questão do valor também, né, que ela colocou. O Janaway, ele devolveu criticando o panteísmo, né, ele acredita que há no Schopenhauer uma crítica, uma crítica severa do panteísmo, né, que é uma noção vazia, que o panteísmo, muitas vezes, ele é redundante, ele fala apenas que o mundo é o mundo, né, e ele também acredita que a questão material não é tão importante nessa fundação última da ética, porque, em última instância, a matéria ela é a síntese do espaço, tempo e causalidade, né? Ela é o correlato ali do entendimento. Então, o que seria, né, essa realidade última, ele acredita que não é exatamente a matéria, né? É o né, mas é um não material, né? E, por fim, a questão do valor, ele relativizou bastante também. Ele acha que a ética ele relembra a gente que a ética do Schopenhauer ela é descritiva, né, ela não é prescritiva, e que, portanto, né, se a gente enfatizar demais a questão do valor, a gente pode empobrecer a ética, né? Ele está descrevendo como que as pessoas lidam, né, com esses termos, né, de bom e mal. E, em última instância, o que está em jogo, né, é que a compaixão ela só pode realmente ser um caminho, né, de visão, de experiência superior, por causa do né, um caminho superior em relação ao egoísmo por causa do É isso que é o principal. Né? Bom, a Sandra devolveu falando que não é uma visão tão epistêmica assim, essa do Schopenhauer, né, que ela citou a música, citou a compaixão e o misticismo, né, então Schopenhauer está propondo algo que vai além apenas de uma descrição quantitativa, né, mas o Janaway realmente ele acredita né, que o centro ali da ética é o né, essas outras questões estão subordinadas a isso. Tá suficiente? Tá bom? Tá, imagina. So, we have another question from Rafael. So, please, Rafael, go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, thank you so much for your beautiful talk. I almost agree with everything you said, and I'm really curious about something you touched upon at the end. Namely, the connection between the concept of oneness and the connection of negativity or nothingness. And I'm wondering if there's not a crucial difference to Hindu or Indian thinking and the thinking of Schopenhauer. If I understood you correctly, I think that in Indian or in Hindu thinking, nothing is absolute universal negation, whereas for Schopenhauer, nothing means relative negation. I think at the end, in the Will of Representation, he quotes Plato's sophist, and he's saying, well, if I say nothing, I mean it like Plato in the sophist, in the sense of identity and difference. So the will is actually not a contradiction to this world as a thing in itself, namely it's just different, and we could change the position from plus to minus. And now, isn't that a basic difference between Indian thinking and the thinking of Schopenhauer? Shall I translate into Portuguese first, or should I wait?
Hey,
vou traduzir?
Yes, please.
Então, eu fiz uma pergunta sobre o conceito de nada. Segundo minha opinião, a nada na filosofia indiana é uma nada absoluta, uma negação universal. Mas em Schopenhauer eu acho que é uma nada relativa, uma nada que ela fala também como Platão, uma nada em termos de entidade e diferença. A diferença entre a vontade como coisa em si é somente diferente deste mundo, não completamente contraditório. E eu acho que isso é uma diferença que tem o Schopenhauer com o pensamento indiano.
Well, thank you for the question. I'm reluctant to generalize too much about Indian thought. I mean, but the one interesting factor here, which I think Vivekananda was also referring to, was that Schopenhauer is also very influenced by Buddhism and the notion of nirvana, which is a kind of extinguishment, like a fire being extinguished. And Schopenhauer equates nirvana with a kind of nothingness, which really is not present in Hindu thought. So I think there is at least I think we would have to make a distinction there. I think you're right that the notion of nothingness in Hindu thought is not the same as Schopenhauer's. I think that's right. But Schopenhauer actually, I mean, there's a whole other dimension to Schopenhauer's reception of Indian thought, of course, is his reception of Buddhism, which he tends to assimilate to Hinduism, or Brahmanism, as he calls it. But many people have said, look, you have to distinguish those things. So I think what he says about nothingness is more influenced, the idea of after the, when you reach the Verneinung des Willens, there's a kind of nothing. Is it an absolute nothing or a relative nothing? I think he's there very much even though he quotes the Opecnut there, he's actually very influenced by Buddhism, which really doesn't represent the Hindu tradition, because there is no oneness, there is no ultimate reality. Well, in some aspects of Buddhism, there's no ultimate reality at all. So I think my answer to that would have to be complicated, but I think my instinct at the moment is to say you're right, that we should distance Schopenhauer's what he says about nothingness. We should distance that from Hinduism. I think that basic instinct is right. I don't have anything much more to say right now, but it's certainly something worth pursuing. Yeah.
Thank you. Então ele respondeu que ele também pensa que a nada hinduísta e a nada schopenhaueriana são diferentes, mas ele acha que também tem uma tradição do budismo e elas têm outro conceito também mais relativo, como que pode ser mais perto ao conceito do Schopenhauer. Então, o que ele falou, isso poderia ser um conceito bem complicado, pode ser em termos da negação da vontade, em termos mais práticos, mas o que ele também acha que o conceito da nada hinduísta e o conceito do Schopenhauer da nada relativa é provavelmente correto.
Thank you so much, Rafael. So now we have a question of Daniel. So please, Daniel.
Hard question, please.
Hello all, good morning, Professor. I'm glad to hear you. And well, maybe I'll ask a question that is similar to the other questions that are being made here, but I'll try to do it in another way, another form. Well, based on your knowledge that you showed us about the Advaita Vedanta and of the Vivekananda's critique of will as a thing in itself, as an absolute one, I would like to know what you think about the following way of understanding Schopenhauer's philosophy, in which relates to Vedanta, indeed. Well, in one side we have Nirguna Brahman, the unconditioned Brahman, which would be the oneness, the monist truth that you talked about, as a manifestation of it, as a conditioned way of conceiving Brahman, is this Saguna Brahman. We have the worldly manifestation of the one, of this one. It is as a cosmic will, which is a foundation of a Schopenhauerian version of an emanation theory in some kind of Platonic or Neoplatonic way of conceiving it. And this will be the will as ideas in nature and apprehended through the work of art, etc. What do you think of this way of understanding the metaphysic of Schopenhauer? Thank you.
Yes, this is another aspect that I didn't consider. So there is it's not really in the Upanishads, but in the later Vedanta tradition, there is this idea of something similar to will, which is a force that manifests itself in nature, and the transmission of this idea to Schopenhauer is actually very complicated. If you read the book by Urs App about Schopenhauer's compass, you find that the notion of Maya in the Opecnut is translated as amor, as love, and Schopenhauer also as voluntas aeterna. So Schopenhauer got the original idea of the will actually as thing in itself, or it was influenced by reading that version of the Upanishads, strangely, even though this idea of this cosmic force that develops into the world as a kind of love or desire isn't really in the Upanishads. I think it's a later Vedanta edition. So this just shows that in terms of the reception and the transmission, the story is extremely complicated, because Schopenhauer thought he was getting the original Upanishads, but actually he was getting a kind of 17th century version that had gone through Sufism and all sorts of other things, and later Vedanta. So that's a complicated answer. But so, yes, I mean, there's the book by, I don't know if you know the book by Stephen Cross on Schopenhauer and Indian philosophy, but he makes quite a lot of this. And there's the notion of Shakti as well, this idea of a kind of urge or striving force in the universe that is compared with as will. That's a whole dimension of Hindu philosophy that I just left out. But I think it's again, that would be will as manifest in the phenomenal realm rather than the ultimate reality that is oneness. So I think that aspect would be consistent with the way I was trying to read Schopenhauer. But I think that it's a complicated story. But thanks for the question.
Será que você poderia... Isso.
A pergunta e a resposta também, porque eu não traduzi a pergunta. Bom, eu perguntei para ele, né, baseado nesse conhecimento que ele demonstrou no texto sobre o Advaita Vedanta e a crítica do Swami Vivekananda a essa concepção de vontade de Schopenhauer como coisa em si, pensando nisso como uma realidade absoluta, né? Então, baseado nisso que ele falou, eu perguntei para ele o que ele acha da seguinte forma de entender a filosofia de Schopenhauer, que eu coloquei, né? Mas enfim, também existe as pessoas falando coisas parecidas, que é o seguinte, né? Você colocando de um lado um Brahman, que é o Nirguna Brahman, que é o Brahman sem qualidades, sem atributos, que seria esse uno, esse oneness, né? Essa verdade monista que a pessoa falou. Abaixo disso, né? Como uma manifestação condicionada, né? Com atributos desse Brahman, está aí um Saguna Brahman, enquanto uma manifestação mundana desse uno como a vontade cósmica. E essa vontade cósmica, se fundando uma cosmologia que é uma versão Schopenhaueriana da teoria da emanação platonista ou neoplatonista. E essa, né, seria justamente a vontade como ideia na natureza, e aprendida através da obra de arte. Eu perguntei o que ele acha desse tipo de maneira de entender a filosofia de Schopenhauer. Ele respondeu que, bom, uma questão complexa. Ele citou o fato de que a literatura que Schopenhauer consultou das Upaniṣades não apresentava uma versão, uma versão diferente, né, do Vedanta que a gente conhece hoje em dia, trazendo outras influências e, por exemplo, ele fala do conceito de Maya enquanto amor, na Opecnut, né, que é essa tradução que o Schopenhauer leu, latina, e que traria um pouco essa noção de uma vontade cósmica, né? Ele citou isso como estando na obra do Urzap. E ele também citou a obra do Stephen Cross, que fala sobre o conceito de Shakti, também como análogo a essa ideia de vontade cósmica. Mas ele, aí, enfim, ele fechou falando que sobre essa noção da vontade como coisa em si mesma, como coisa em si absoluta, para ele realmente o mais próximo da visão dele é encarar a vontade como uma manifestação na natureza e não enquanto uma realidade absoluta. Acho que foi isso.
Perfeito. So we have a last question of Alessandro Novembre.
Thank you.
So,
yes, thank you for your very interesting report. My question is very short. Schopenhauer attributes to the saint and the mystic of all time an intuitive knowledge of the thing in itself. Indeed, even Indian texts believe that an intuitive knowledge of the one essence of the world is possible. But this part of Schopenhauer's argument is hardly compatible with the assumed unknowability of the thing in itself. I would like to ask you something that I have not been able to grasp well from your paper and from your answers to the previous questions, namely, in your opinion, is Schopenhauer to be taken seriously when he says that the saint and the mystic have an intuitive, direct, immediate knowledge of the thing in itself, eine unmittelbare, intuitive Erkenntnis des Dings an sich. Many scholars gloss over this point, but I think Schopenhauer is to be taken seriously here too, with all the consequences and all the problems that come with it. And since I will also be talking about this in my paper later, I would like to know your opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, it is a difficult issue. I mean, I'm mindful of the fact that Schopenhauer says, on the one hand, he talks about knowledge of the thing in itself. On the other hand, in the same passage towards the end of The World as Will and Representation, he says, we can't really talk about knowledge here because the distinction between subject and object disappears. So it's not really, you can't really, it's beyond the question whether it is a kind of knowledge or not a kind of erkenntnis. Almost disappear, you know, you can't really decide whether it's a kind of knowledge or just a kind of, as it were, dissolution of the individual self into the one. And it's at this point he starts saying that, you know, we can't describe it, only mysticism remains, and so on. So I think it is difficult to think that this state of willlessness would be, in any ordinary sense, a kind of knowledge for Schopenhauer. That, I suppose, that's my immediate answer, but he does say it. So I think that is the problem. I agree with you, it's a problem. I've tried in this paper not to talk about the Verneinung des Willens, you know, the willlessness, mysticism, and self, you know, negation of the will. Try to treat the ethics on its own merits. But in terms of the relation to Vedanta, then there is obviously in Vedanta the idea of liberation, moksha. You become entirely liberated by reuniting with this oneness, which I guess has to be seen as a kind of knowledge. So it's the removal of avidya, which is ignorance. So it's a kind of knowledge which is an identifying with Brahman, the oneness. So there's something analogous that Schopenhauer wants when he starts talking about willlessness and negation of the will. But I think that's another chapter for me, because I wanted to treat the ethics separately from what happens later in the world as well in representation. So I hope that's not a terribly evasive answer, but thank you for the question. It's a very good one.
Thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor. I will try to translate. And to Alessandro November. Bom, o Alessandro perguntou sobre a questão do conhecimento intuitivo, né? Se o Janaway acredita que há no Schopenhauer uma aprovação, né, uma confirmação de que as seitas hindus, budistas, brahmanistas, elas proporcionam, né, uma espécie de conhecimento intuitivo do Oneness, né, do todo, né, da realidade última. Isso é um problema gigantesco, né? Ele falou que para ele, né, de acordo com as pesquisas dele, né, e ele não entendeu exatamente a resposta do professor, e o Janaway respondeu que, enfim, que é uma questão realmente muito difícil, né, que no final do livro do Mundo, Vontade de Representação, né, o livro 4, o Schopenhauer fala que não é conhecimento, né, exatamente a questão da autonegação da vontade, da compaixão, porque aqui a gente já está num nível em que sujeito e objeto, né, eles se identificaram de alguma maneira, né, ou eles foram suprimidos, e conhecimento só existe a partir do sujeito e objeto, né. Então, na realidade, há uma dissolução do indivíduo no todo, né. E isso, na verdade, o Janaway acredita que não é passível muito de ser chamado de conhecimento, né? Conhecimento é uma outra coisa, né, que realmente parte do sujeito e objeto. Mas, por outro lado, o Janaway fala que o Schopenhauer afirma que é conhecimento em alguns momentos, né? Então, realmente é uma questão e tanto, e ele procurou não entrar, né, nos temas aqui da negação da vontade e do misticismo, né, porque o tema da ética já dá trabalho demais, vamos falar assim, né, ele preferiu se concentrar no tema da ética, né, da compaixão. Ele citou o Vedanta, que tem essa ideia da reunião, né, com Brahman, e que há ali, sim, uma ideia de que há um conhecimento nessa reunião com Brahman, né? Porque essa reunião ela é uma espécie de supressão da ignorância original, né? Então há, sim, uma questão no Vedanta, né, de que é um conhecimento, mas é uma coisa que se assemelha muito a como aparece no Schopenhauer, né? Ou seja, e não é um conhecimento, vamos falar assim, né? É um conhecimento em sentido amplo, mas não em sentido estrito, seria talvez uma solução, né? Bom, mas isso seria um outro capítulo, né, da abordagem dele, e ele realmente preferiu se limitar aqui no tema da ética, que já é bastante grande, já dá bastante trabalho, né? Seria mais ou menos isso, gente? Acho que sim, né? Tá. So, Janaway, we thank you so much for your brilliant conference. It was unforgettable for all of us. Sorry if it was too exhausting. No, we pass off the time. And we invite you to follow our Congress. We will have other conference now. So thank you so much and welcome.
Thank you very much. I think I will return later. For the moment, I'm afraid, apologies to Luan, but I can't be here now, but I will be back later.
No
Thank you very
problem
much
at all.
indeed. Very good questions, and thank you very much.